everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Democracy on the Left, hosted by Platypus Affiliated Society. Before Joe introduces our speakers and the panel itself, I just want to say a few things about this chapter. My name is Wentai. I'm the chapter head for Platypus on this campus. And we host coffee breaks, reading groups, and public fora, such as this, as well as publish the Platypus Review. And actually, the most recent issue and the second to most recent issue of the Platypus Reviews are with Nate, so please pick one up. Our coffee breaks are on Tuesday afternoons from 4:30 to 6 at Harper Cafe, and we just generally talk about politics, whatever's going on there. We also informally introduce our project. And our reading group, which is on the history of the left, so we cover authors such as Marx, Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, Adorno, Horkheimer. That's hosted on Monday evenings from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock in Easter evenings. So thank you all for coming.
All right. So, topic tonight is democracy in the left. We have a description here. Before I read the description, I just want to give a short account, explain Platypus as succinctly as I can. Platypus was started in 2006, and it is an organization that seeks to host the conversation on leftist politics. We have fora such as this. We have, as Wentai mentioned, various other manifestations. There are various other ways in which we try to do this on campuses, since we are a campus-based organization, including publishing the Platypus Review, which is our forum in print, and having film screenings. And we also, here at University of Chicago, we have a radio show that I believe it's going to be back on the air. Yes. On Tuesdays, which is when we actually interview people on the left, students, do book reviews, sometimes just play old recordings of leftists.
Radical Minds.
It's called Radical Minds. So I'm just going to read, before introducing our speakers, the description for the event. So, from the financial crisis and the bank bailouts to the question of sovereign debt, from the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street, from the struggle for a unified European-wide policy to the elections in Greece and Egypt that seem to have threatened so much and promised so little, the need to go beyond mere protest has asserted itself. Political revolution is in the air again. At the same time, the elections in the U.S. and recently in Germany, by comparison, to be a non-event, despite potentially having far-reaching consequences for teeming issues worldwide. Today, the people, the demos, seem resigned to their political powerlessness, even as they rage against the corruption of politics. Hence, while contemporary demands for democracy to politicize the demos, they are also indicative of social and political regression that asks urgently for recognition and reflection. Demands for democracy from below end up being expressed from above. The 99%, in its already obscure and unorganized character, didn't express itself as such in the various recent elections, but was split in various tendencies, many of them very reactionary. Democracy retains an enigmatic character, since it always slips any fixed form and content, since people under the dynamic of capital keep demanding at time more democracy and real democracy. But democracy can be like Janus. It often expresses both the progressive social and emancipatory demands, but also their defeat, their hijacking by an elected Bonaparte. What is the history informing the demands for greater democracy today? How does the left adequately promote or not the cause of popular empowerment? What are the potential futures for democratic revolution, especially as understood by the left? And we provided several prompts, questions to the speakers to help them organize their talks. There were 8 of them. The first, what would you consider to be real democracy? As this has been a primary demand of recent spontaneous forms of discontent. Exempli Agratia, Arab Spring, Occupy, anti-austerity protests, student strikes. Number 2, what is the relationship between democracy and the working class today? Do you consider historical struggles for democracy by workers as a medium by which they got assimilated into the system, or the only path to emancipation that they could avoid trying to take? Number 3, do you consider it as necessary to eschew established forms of mass politics in favor of new forms in order to build democratic movement, or are current mass forms of politics adequate for a democratic society? Number 4, why has democracy emerged as a primary demand of spontaneous forms of discontent? Do you also consider it necessary or adequate to deal with the pathologies of our era? Number 5, Engels wrote that, quote, "A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is," end quote. Do you agree? Can this conception be compatible with the struggle for democracy? Number 6, how is democracy related with the issue of possibly overcoming capital? Number 7, is there a difference between the ancient and the modern notion of democracy? And if so, what is the source of that difference? Does real democracy share more with the direct democracy of ancient polis? Number 8, is democracy oppressive, or can it be such? How do you judge Lenin's formulation that democracy is also a state, and that consequently democracy will also disappear with the state as it disappears? All right, and seated in the order that we'll be receiving them, we have Mike Goldfield, who, let me just, one moment. Michael Goldfield is a long-term political activist. He was one as a student at University of Chicago. Is that right? UC you wrote? Okay. And as an in-plant labor agitator for many years. He is currently a professor at Wayne State University in Detroit, and has published a number of articles and books on labor, race, and the global economy, including The Decline of Organized Labor in the United States, The Color of Politics, Race and the Mainsprings of American Politics and Labor, Globalization and the State, with Dubas Banerjee. He has most recently written a lengthy review piece on the current attacks on U.S. unions. On the far left, we have August Nimtz.
That's a far left.
Sorry. I guess we're going to find out. He's a professor of political science and African American studies at the University of Minnesota. Among his publications that relate to tonight's issues are a book, Marx and Engels, Their Contribution to the Democratic Breakthrough, 2000, and Marx, Tocqueville, and Race in America, The Absolute Democracy or Defiled Republic, 2003. He also has forthcoming a pair of books to be published by Palgrave Macmillan, Lenin's Electoral Strategy for Marx and Engels Through the Revolution of 1905, The Ballot or the Streets, or Both, and Lenin's Electoral Strategy from 1907 to the October Revolution of 1917, The Ballot, the Streets, or Both. He's also co-coordinator of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee. In the middle, we have Staudenmaier, Peter Staudenmaier, almost did it again. Peter Staudenmaier teaches history, modern European intellectual history at Marquette University in Milwaukee. He is currently teaching a course entitled Dimensions of Democracy. His research concentrates on Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, anti-Semitism, and the history of racial thought and environmental history. He is taught at the Institute for Social Ecology and has been involved in a variety of anarchist, environmental, and anti-capitalist movements over the years in the U.S. as well as in Germany. And his perspective on democracy has been shaped by many years of working with worker collectives and directly democratic communities, including the Rainbow Bookstore Cooperative, which is a communally owned and collectively run radical bookstore, and the Madison Community Cooperative, which is a federation of resident-owned and run collective housing projects. So each of our speakers is going to give a 10 to 12 minute presentation. We're going to follow that with the speakers will be allowed to give responses to each other, about 3 to 5 minutes each, and then we'll open up to questions after that. Mr. Goldfield.
Yeah, I was actually here, student here 3 different times. I was here, first I came into philosophy, and then I was working full-time in the student movement. I came back for a year and a half, was kicked out of school, We lived in the administration building next door for 11 or 12 days or something like that. And then I came back 10 years later and eventually got a degree. So democracy is a complex subject. So I just want to give a few bullet points. The starting point on looking for democracy in a society without capitalism, is the analysis of Marx of the Paris Commune of 1871. The Paris Commune did a number of things which Marx considered key to democracy in a society. It abolished conscription and the standing army, and everybody else got armed, the populace. Had universal voting rights, including for foreigners, felons, no necessity to be a citizen. Religion was considered a matter of individual conscience. All symbols were removed from public life. This was, in fact, the initial position of, or the position for their lives of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The intent of the founding fathers, for those who are interested, I'm not particularly interested, was no chaplains, no crucifixes, no prayer rooms, any place. And this is why the Texas Tea Partiers who control the State Board of Education have eliminated Jefferson as a founding father from Texas textbooks. The Paris Commune closed all pawn shops and moratoriums on rents. And representatives were immediately recallable by the people they represented, and they were paid the wages of the average working person, and something that they didn't fully institute, but they intended to do was to seize and control all productive facilities and have them democratically run. So these, Marx argued, are the starting points for a true democracy in a society. So democracy under capitalism is not by any stretch democracy. In the U.S., to quote Engels' words, there are two gangs of political speculators who sell themselves out to the highest bidders. Democrats, too, of course, they get their money from Wall Street, high-tech firms, or whatever, and why no one should have been disappointed in Obama and the Democrats and anything that they've done. I'm not disappointed or disillusioned because I had no expectations. And we're, of course, well aware of disparities in tax rates, gross inequalities, lack of regulations, the ease of amassing immense wealth by the wealthy, the difficulties of the, whatever they are, the 99%, the rest of us. So the system of capitalism is rigged. Liberals and social democrats think that these things can be fundamentally changed under capitalism. Marxists respectfully disagree. Democracy potentially functions under capitalism in this system at the margins. In 2008, for example, 80% of the population, when polled and was explained to them, chose single-payer health care, which was not a congressional option. In 1933, a majority of the people in the country said they wanted the banks nationalized, and we got Glass-Steagall bank reform, which was a very thin read. So even normal bourgeois democracy is being constricted today immensely. The Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, which allows unlimited financial contributions without identification. The vast restriction of the franchise, which is taking place today, making it more difficult for poor, elderly students away at school, and of course many non-whites to vote, are even violations of this limited form of bourgeois democracy. The completely unrestrained rule of capital and business is historically modified to a certain extent by strong working class organizations, which are greatly on the decline and limited in this country, and mass mobilizations. So some examples of things historically that have taken place in this country, what I would call at the margins. In 1891, coal miners in Coal Creek, Tennessee, went on strike, and the company, with the connivance of the state legislature, rented out convict miners to run the mines. The miners, along with support from townspeople who flourished with the higher union wages, burned down the stockades, fought off the National Guard and freed all the prisoners and let them go. When the federal government called in troops, railroad workers refused to transport the troops, and a large percentage of people in the state came with arms to the state capitol to protest. Eventually, the miners were defeated, but the state legislature was so rattled within a couple months, even though they had voted almost unanimously to allow convict labor, it was banned in Tennessee, which became the first of the southern states to get rid of convict labor. In 1936, outside of Pittsburgh, when steel workers were having trouble organizing, and this was the center of the nation's steel production, the steel companies had police, either local police or their own police, many thousands of them, who, when they came across union organizers, were beaten and murdered, and basically people couldn't hold a rally. So, and this happened in a number of places, but in one incident, 10,000 armed miners from Pennsylvania, who had organized in 1933, marched into town. I think it was in Aliquippa. And when they were asked what they were doing there, they said they were there to ensure that the steelworkers had a peaceful union organizing rally, and it proceeded to do so. And so democracy makes it difficult to function in these situations, and this is among the reasons I don't support liberal demands for gun control. So the classical Marxist position on participating in elections under capitalism is not to run or support anyone running for executive positions. One can elect and campaign for legislative representatives, but they're elected only for agitational purposes and to talk. Or in the words of Karl Liebknecht, a leader of the German Social Democratic Party, one of only two to vote against war appropriations in World War I, said that his purpose was to talk auf dem Fenster, out the window. So nothing he said was designed to talk to the legislature, was designed to use his purse to talk to people. As he did in opposing World War I from the German Bundestag, he was eventually drafted, and then after the war he was murdered along with Rosa Luxemburg after the war by the Social Democratic-run Ebert government. Still, even without the intervention of capital, democracy as a value is only one of several principles, I would argue, at times coming into conflict with more universal principles of freedom, justice, and equality, and class solidarity. This, I would argue, is a fatal flaw, in my opinion, in those ultra-democratic, ultra-left, and syndicalist tendencies that extol democracy above all else. There is a universal fight against oppression, which at times democracy undermines. So anti-immigrant xenophobia, for example, should always be opposed, whether the majority supports it or not. This tension can be found in the old IWW. The ultra-democrats who wanted to abolish the national office and have everything controlled at the local level often ended up, their successors ended up in very reactionary positions. So this is evident, for example, in the Sailors Union of the Pacific, a branch of the Seamen's International Union, supported in the 1930s and 1940s for their wobbly roots by the Workers' Party and some elements of the Socialist Worker Party for their frequent work stoppages. They were an all-white union that often struck to keep blacks from being employed on ships, extolled by one of the heroes of this tendency, Stan Weir, who supported them against the National Maritime Union, which was a communist-led union that fought to hire black and Latino sailors and to upgrade them positions on the ships. It's also evident in the Southern, more recently in the Southern white backlash to the civil rights movement, which undoubtedly in many Southern states had majority white support. And it seems to me that democracy in those situations should be opposed relying on broader, more important principles. But finally, there can be no real democracy without a break from capital. Evidence for this abounds in the recent period. In South Africa, the African National Congress, COSATU, the Trade Union Confederation, and the South African Communist Party Alliance, which played a key role in overthrowing apartheid, catered almost immediately to South African capital, enriched many of its leaders, and has done hardly anything for its main supporters, finally murdering and defending the murder of striking miners in 2012 at Marikana, who rejected the sellout COSATU union. A similar thing had happened earlier in India, I would argue. A radical trade union movement led by the left, by communists and others, was broken after 1947 independence as the Congress Party cemented its alliance with Indian capital, and all the sort of rubbish about Indian socialism after independence is purely that. That the only place where these unions were not fully broken was in the state of Kerala, one of 30 Indian states. Now many people's dream of an ideal social democratic state with universal health care, universal education, a literacy rate for both men and women higher than the United States, relatively high agricultural wages in India, and in the rest of India and in parts of Kerala too, workers and farmers still continue to suffer. So it seems to me that for those of us on the left, particularly those of us who consider ourselves Marxists, that it's important to demand for the expansion of bourgeois democracy and the restriction of power of money under capitalism. These are important demands, as is curbing the unrestrained rule of capital, whether it be workplace safety, gender and racial equality, a broad safety net, including complete free health care, free education, housing, subsistence, raising minimum wages, etc., while at the same time recognizing that these are at best unsecure bulwarks which alleviate suffering and that assist the full struggle against capital to be eventually replaced by a permanent system of individual liberty, social equality, justice for all, and yes, democratic control.
Now for August Nimtz.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and have this discussion and to see if there really is a working class alternative to business as usual and the crisis that afflicts humanity on a global basis. I want to draw upon the lessons that Marx, Engels, and Lenin distilled about the history of the class struggle to try to answer, if not directly, indirectly, the questions that were posed to us. Indeed, if there's one thing the last 5 years have made very clear, and that is the utter incompatibility between the capitalist mode of production and real democracy. And the young Karl Marx, beginning at least in 1843, began to, as a radical Democrat, indeed began to realize this, and in fact it was the United States that offered very important lessons to the young Marx, because it was in the United States where political democracy was most present. And for the young Marx, if this was the best that political democracy had to offer, given all of the social inequalities that existed within the United States, then clearly something else was needed. And it was the conclusions, the reading of the United States that led the young Marx, radical Democrat, to communist conclusions. And one of the lessons of the United States was that indeed, as long as you have an economic system that allows for inequalities in wealth, and continues to deepen those inequalities in wealth, those with more wealth will use their wealth to shape political outcomes to serve their interests. Thus, the fundamental incompatibility with real democracy or substantive democracy. They use their wealth to impose their will on the rest of us, and what Marx began increasingly referring to as the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And the only answer to that would be the working class taking power and imposing its will on the bourgeoisie, to deny the bourgeoisie the freedom to use its wealth to determine whether or not we would have work, jobs, whether or not we would have a roof over our heads, whether or not we would have health care. In other words, the term he began to employ in the context of the 1848, 1849 revolutions was the dictatorship of the proletariat. And we can come back and discuss what Marx actually meant by it. But no more and no less than the working class, the majority, imposing its will on the capitalist class. At the micro level, when Marx wrote Capital, he also diagnosed this incompatibility between democracy and capital. And at the end of chapter 6, in very memorable paragraphs about from the exchange to production, what happens in the process of production, and where workers then will come under the gun. They're about to get their hides tanned by the bosses when they go into the workplace. The absence, in other words, it's incompatible for the working class to have democracy in relationship to capital, and nowhere was this clear. At least I discovered a few years ago when I learned that the Bill of Rights, the U.S. Bill of Rights, does not apply in the private sector in the workplace. The ACLU says this is one of the constant complaints that they get, but they can't do anything about it because that's not what the Bill of Rights was intended to do, which we therefore shouldn't be surprised at. Nevertheless, given these incompatibilities and so on, Marx and Engels fought for political democracy. They were the first socialist group to argue that the fight for working class taking political power is through the fight for political democracy, the battle for democracy, as it's called in the manifesto. And at the very end of the manifesto, and the particular kinds of programs and tactics and strategies and so on, especially in Germany, the fight was for the battle for democracy through necessary for the working class to be able to take political power. This is what distinguished the Marxists from other political currents, especially the anarchists, who argued that the fight for political democracy was a diversion from the fight for workers actually taking political power. And Marx and Engels disagreed with that perspective. Coming out of that was written, the manifesto was written before, a month before the 1848, 1849 revolutions began. And coming out of the 1848, 1849 revolution, they began to draw a number of important lessons. And the most important lesson they drew had to do with the vacillation and the ambivalence of the bourgeoisie itself toward liberal or political democracy. This is what was revealed both in France and in Germany. They were willing, in fact, to seek a Bonapartist solution. In the case of France, certainly willing to suspend political democracy if necessary. Yet Marx and Engels argued that this betrayal by the bourgeoisie of political democracy in the 1848, 1849 revolutions required the working class to pursue independent working class political action. Perhaps the most important programmatic conclusion that they drew was that the working class needed its own political parties. The working class might enter into alliances with the bourgeoisie if it acts in a revolutionary way, but it must never talk about unity. The difference between alliances and unity. This phenomenon of the bourgeoisie suspending liberal democracy is very evident, I think, in our time, especially when economic crises occur. As some of us know, what we're beginning to witness, especially in places like Michigan and so on, is how indeed liberal democracy is suspended, where indeed the elected officials are no longer permitted to make the kinds of decisions that they had been able to make. Representative government itself comes under attack. And I understand there are a number of cities in Michigan where this is the case. If you look at what's going on in Europe, when the effective decision-making being taken out of the hands of elected officials in Greece and elsewhere and so on, being made by the IMF, being made by the European the Commission, and also the European Central Bank. For my generation, the first example of this was in the 1974-1975 New York City fiscal crisis, where you had what was called the Emergency Financial Control Board was put together, and real decision-making was taken out of the hands of elected officials. It was in place for a couple of years. It's interesting to go back and read Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address in 1933. I missed this the first time, but to go back and read it again. And that is, he actually raised the possibility of suspending the Constitution in order to deal with the crisis. And he was advised by none other than the liberal commentator, Walter Lippmann, actually to do that. The economic crisis itself might require having to suspend the Constitution. So there's this tension, at least, between the bourgeoisie and political democracy, or bourgeois democracy itself. All right. Okay, what is to be done? What is the response to the working class to this? In 1920, 3 years after the Bolsheviks took power, Lenin wrote that Bolshevik participation in the Tsarist parliaments, known as Dumas, in the 4 Dumas between 1906 and 1915, was, quote unquote, indispensable in the Bolsheviks being able to take power. I'll read that again. In 1920, in a well-known work, it's not some obscure document, it's in Left-Wing Communism, Lenin says that Bolshevik participation in the 4 parliaments, known as Dumas, the Tsarist Dumas and so on, between 1906 and 1915 were indispensable in why the Bolsheviks were able to take power in 1917. For Lenin, participation in the parliamentary arena, even the most limited parliamentary arena, which was the case with the Tsarist Dumas and so on, is necessary for the working class to chart independent working class political action. Lenin called it revolutionary parliamentarism. This is the term he gave to it in order to distinguish it from what would become 20th century social democratic use employment of the parliamentary arena. He oftentimes made reference to a term that Marx and Engels used, parliamentary cretinism, which may not be politically correct these days, but parliamentary cretinism was a term that Marx and Engels made use of and that Lenin loved to make use of, and that it was the illusion to think that the beginning and the end of politics takes place within the framework of parliaments. I've coined a term to go along with parliamentary cretinism that I call voting fetishism. The March 1850 address of Marx and Engels, an 11-page document, was the basis for Lenin's electoral strategy. It's in that document that Marx and Engels make clear the purpose of participating in a parliamentary process, elections and so on, is it gives the working class, through independent working class political action, an opportunity to count one's forces, to get out one's ideas. And participating in the electoral process workers should never be discouraged by the claim that by running candidates, they will be splitting the vote and will allow a few reactionaries to get elected. It was these kernels that Lenin drew upon in order to put forward his electoral strategy, which I've detailed in 2 volumes that will be published by Palgrave Macmillan. I make a number of arguments, 4 arguments, which I won't get a chance to go into, but I'll simply note that for Lenin, participation in Parliament was necessary for the working class to chart a course for independent working class political action, but at the same time recognizing that Soviet representative government was superior to parliamentary representative government. And Soviet representative government was inspired for Lenin by the developments that took place, the lessons of the Paris Commune. Finally, I'll just mention, without getting into details, we can get into the discussion and so on. It's my position, it's my belief that the only country in the world where the working class is actually in power is in Cuba. It's the only place where the working class is in power, where the dictatorship of the proletariat is in place. And nothing illustrates this more than what has taken place in the last couple of weeks in Cuba. And that is discussions and debates in thousands of workplaces in Cuba to draft a new labor code for Cuba. And the debates and discussions that took place and so on. Something that could never take place within a capitalist country. Workers will never have the right to be able to discuss, debate, and vote on what the labor codes will be.
You'll be giving it back to me in a moment. Okay, thanks to Joseph and the other Platypus folks locally here for hosting this. These are wonderful discussions to have. I wanted to start out by actually taking exception to the way that a number of the questions you posed to all of us were framed. I want to put into question the very notion of, quote, real democracy, unquote. In fact, I've already forgotten your name, but you... One time. You gave a nice little set of introductory remarks, and you mentioned a radical philosopher named Theodore Adorno. And Adorno, in admittedly a very different context, he used to offer this intensive critique of something that he called the jargon of authenticity. And I'm a little worried that sometimes the left itself falls into a different kind of jargon of authenticity when we talk about principles like democracy. And it makes sense that we do that because we're living in a social context that so consistently abuses those terms, and we understandably want to sort of reclaim them and say, no, democracy is not all this nonsense about once every 4 years you get to pull a little lever and that's your democratic duty. Instead, it's this other thing. Nonetheless, I do think it's worth reminding ourselves that democracy has always been a contested notion, always, for 2,500 years now. The heart of democracy is essentially saying there are things that we don't all agree about, and a democratic forum or democratic procedures, or however you want to conceive of it, that is what allows us to hash out our differences. Democracy is a historical phenomenon. It doesn't have a kind of authentic essence that we could protect and that we could define and say, this is the real democracy, and that stuff over there is a fake. So that's going to sort of be the premise of my remarks. It's also very important to remember, I think, that democracy has typically been a minority current of thought for most of human history. In fact, in the Western context, for virtually all of Western history, democracy has been on the defensive. Democracy has normally been outnumbered and outmaneuvered by flatly anti-democratic forms of governance. There's sort of a temptation to think in purely modern terms and assume falsely that we're always living in an increasingly democratic society. That's, historically speaking, a very important mistake. Maybe more important than just the external contestation of democracy is the fact that democracy is also always internally contested. Folks who agree that they like democracy typically disagree radically on what it is that we like about democracy. There's disagreements on the panelists. I'm sure there's disagreements in the room here. Democracy is the kind of thing that is simultaneously vague enough and inspiring enough that it allows us to attach very different sets of values to it. So, for example, right before the panel started, the three of us were talking briefly about the events in Madison, Wisconsin, just up the road, two and a half years ago now, the spring of 2011. And in a certain sense, whatever else those events were and were not, in a certain sense, that was a classic example of a clash between two utterly different notions of democracy. On the one hand, you had a democratically elected governor and a democratically elected legislature, which was using what it considered its building, the state capitol, which is where it does its work, was using that building to systematically restrict the rights of workers, restrict the rights of citizens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side of that struggle, you had a group of workers and students and a nice cross-section of the people of Wisconsin who said that, no, the capital doesn't belong to the government, it belongs to the people, and we are here to make sure that the government can't take rights away from the people. So a sort of simplistic way, too simplistic, but I'm going to say it nonetheless, a sort of a simple way to gather up those differences is to say that we have a tension between a representative model of democracy on the one hand, and then a very different alternative model of direct democracy on the other hand. That's an important distinction that runs throughout the history of democratic forms of society. It's not one that we have to sort of solve, but it's one that I think we need to be constantly aware of. So even on the left, in fact, not just even on the left, especially on the left, there are a series of long-standing and unresolved contrary views of democracy. We don't all agree on how participatory democracy could be, should be, ought to be, needs to be. We don't agree on how grassroots it has to be. We don't even really agree on things like, is democracy first and foremost an aspect of movement strategy and organization, or is it more importantly an aspect of our eventual goal, an aspect of the kind of society, the kind of liberated society that we're trying to create? We don't agree on basic questions like, is democracy better seen as a set of procedures? That would be one option. Or maybe a set of institutions? Second option. Maybe it's better seen as a set of outcomes? Third option. Those three things are related to each other, but they're distinct. Or maybe, fourth option, maybe democracy is better seen as a kind of an ethos, a fundamental orientation that one takes to all facets of social life. I think there's one especially important unresolved debate around democracy that, for reasons I don't fully understand, it doesn't get as much attention as I think it deserves, and that is a really basic disagreement between, on the one hand, models of democracy that are centered on consensus, that are centered on the idea that democracy leads us toward a kind of a unified will. In fact, I noticed that I think it's the recent edition of the Platypus thing, it's about Rousseau, am I right about that? All about Rousseau. Rousseau is a good example of this, that, again, without simplifying slightly and being slightly unfair to Rousseau, the basic notion there is that the general will is one. It is unified, and that democracy, not that he was necessarily a Democrat, but play with me here, that democracy will lead us toward a better understanding of what it is that we all share and all agree on. And that's one model of democracy, and it stands in very stark tension to a very different model that's sometimes called agonistic. It's a fancy word that not a lot of people are familiar with, but it basically means agonistic models of democracy basically say, no, the really important thing about democracy is not consensus, but dissensus. That we should, in fact, be encouraging disagreement, encouraging debate, encouraging sees democracy as sort of a continual process of the clash of contrary opinions and points of view, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's a lot of other questions that I think are important to understand about what democracy means that actually cuts across those lineages. In fact, questions that cut across the differences between Marxists and anarchists, the differences between different kinds of Marxists and between different kinds of anarchists. There's a lot of questions about basically, even if we think we agree on what democracy is, how can we put it into practice? How can we enact it in our political lives? And that's a crucial question because, for better or worse, most of our political work doesn't happen in Tahrir Square in Cairo. Most of our political work doesn't happen, for better and for worse, doesn't happen in Zuccotti Park in New York or in the Capitol in Madison in the spring of 2011. Most of our political work and most of our lives are spent in contexts where the possibilities and potentials for democracy are much more limited than that. So we need to think through, how do we find adequate forms, adequate institutional and organizational forms for our democratic aspirations. In the tradition that I come from, left anarchism, anarcho-communism, social anarchism, in that tradition, the answers to that question are usually fairly simple, too simple if you ask me, and they're usually twofold. The basic answer is, okay, directly democratic organizations are one, spontaneous, they arise on their own, supposedly, and two, they are small scale. I think that's actually an appealing political vision in a lot of ways, and I think it's important to note that it has a kind of appeal that extends far beyond just the anarchist milieu itself. But historically speaking, it's not always the case. There are relatively a lot of historical examples of workers' councils or popular assemblies or economic or political confederations that actually extended well beyond the level of spontaneous and small-scale bodies. In any case, it seems to me that the participatory practices of the kind of direct democracy that a lot of the anarchist tradition stands for, I think those are significantly at odds with other currents in left thought, and we need to recognize that, and we need to sort of argue through and debate through some of those things. So whatever we might make of Engels' dictum, that there's nothing, you can't conceive of anything more authoritarian than a revolution, you might dismiss it out of hand, you might sort of, if you're like me, you might sort of grudgingly concede that it's sometimes true. Whatever stance we take toward, I think it's crucial to recognize that also revolutions also bring forth profound democratic potentials. They're not just authoritarian happenings, but they also sort of bring forth profound democratic potentials that have usually gone unfulfilled. That's a very important insight that Hannah Arendt, for example, who wrote this fascinating book called On Revolution, one of her big insights was the notion that there is a revolutionary tradition that has never quite really been historically fulfilled, and that revolutionaries today can potentially reclaim. So, with that unfulfilled potential in mind, I'd like to sort of put an argument out there, sort of put a proposal out there. I'm going to say two things. One, that a commitment to a direct kind of democracy, and I mean genuinely direct democracy that isn't really representative in nature but is more directly grassroots and participatory in nature, I'm going to propose that a commitment to direct democracy can be both the core of a revived left politics. That's a strong claim, that's an important claim, we can agree with it or disagree with it, but it's a way of saying that if we make that reframed version of democracy at the center of a lot of what we do politically, it might offer us the opportunity to reach beyond the normal milieus that a lot of us are used to working in politically. So both that direct democracy can be at the core of a revived left politics, and also that a commitment to direct democracy can be an effective tactical and strategic counterweight. Thank you, Joseph. An effective tactical and strategic counterweight, or a kind of antidote to the authoritarian strands that do commonly arise in revolutionary organizations and in revolutionary situations. So, before I totally run out of time, I'm going to close with a quote from this delightful, I think, wonderfully insightful pamphlet from 1956 from C.L.R. James, great Caribbean revolutionary, called "Every Cook Can Govern," a term that he borrowed from Lenin. By the way, it's a little too nice and sympathetic to ancient Greek democracy, but nonetheless, in the spirit of the times, I have a lot of respect for it. Written very much under the then current impact of the 1956 councilist uprising in Hungary. So C.L.R. James writes near the end of this pamphlet, "Democracy in Greece," he means ancient Greece, 2,500 years ago, "democracy in Greece was constantly seeking to develop practically the best possible society." I like that quote for three reasons. One, he doesn't say democracy gives us a perfect utopia. What he says is it offers us one possible route to the best possible society. Not the great, perfect, ideal society, but the best possible one. Two, I like the emphasis on practice. Not just on building theories, but on building our practice and changing what democracy means that way. And third, I like the notion that democracy is a matter of constant seeking, of constant searching. That democracy is kind of a form of continual responsiveness to the changing world around us. Thank you very much.
All right, so now we're going to go in the same order with responses, beginning with Mike. I think along with democracy, there has to be a commitment to principle.
and I don't want to mischaracterize Peter's remarks, but some of the tendencies seem to me to be misplaced. So I'm less enthralled with Hannah Arendt, not only because she had a compromised relationship with a Nazi who she knew about, Heidegger, but also as I came to see her vision of democracy, which was the small town New England meeting, was historically wrong, and historically wrong for reasons that I think are inevitable. So I'm also the advisor to a secular student group on my campus, Secular Student Alliance. And so I've given some talks for them, so I spent some time studying some of the religious wars that took place both before and after the American Revolution. New England towns were democratic and as repressive as can be. When one group took over the town, they tithed everybody else to support the church that the majority supported. And one reason that Jefferson and Madison in particular thought that any hint of religion should be abolished from public life was the fact that these people were so sectarian. So I think the tendency in small-scale democracy that's spontaneous is often to be very repressive and conformist. To give you a counterexample of where I think principles need to be fought to fight this type of democracy. So in 1931 in Harlan County, Kentucky, there was a strike, lots of coal miners. You may guess I've been studying coal miners. So these coal miners were overwhelmingly white. The union left. There had been people murders, shootouts with sheriffs and whatnot. And when the communist-led National Miners Union came in, helped people organize, and so they set up these soup kitchens. And the white miners did not want black miners to be sitting at their tables in the soup kitchen. And the questions of race are so critical for the United States and often go against democracy. So they took a vote, and of course the white miners wanted separate tables. But the National Miners Union organizer says, we will not let this strike go on or support it unless you change. And they spent 7 to 8 hours arguing and finally convinced, bullied, however you want to call it, because it wasn't just intellectual argument, the miners to accept this. And after that, many of the things were integrated. So the idea that spontaneous forms of democracy on a small scale are something to be extolled or treasures, and I can think of hundreds of other examples beside these two, or should be your most important principle, seems to me to abandon any emancipatory program. And I think that numerous examples in the United States, so as I mentioned before, the wobbly tradition, which I think is a conflicted tradition. There was a battle that went on for years of localists, people who thought that the democracy meant that locals should control all their funds, that there should not be a national office, and a centralist tendency led by Big Bill Haywood, who some of you may have heard of, who was a leader of the Wobblies. And he said that in order that capital was national and international, and you needed to coordinate a struggle. And we were talking about 3 people in their national office at most. And that if you look at the history of where people who had these traditions went, the localists were almost all, I would say, turned out to be reactionary. I mentioned the Seamen's Union. In the Woodworkers Union, the localists were the right wing of the union and demanded successfully that money be kept in districts, and the people in the national office wanted to organize workers in the South, half of whom in the woodworking industry were African American. And they said that this was politically important. The localists, who drew their position from the Wobblies, from the localist wing of the triumphed, and the unionization of woodworkers ended up being, I would say, a disaster. And it was among the most right-wing unions among the right wing of the CIO because of that. So, well, I wouldn't argue that these things are not unimportant. Spontaneous democracies, whether they be strikes or and small-scale things, that's only one piece of the puzzle, and to raise them to some sort of overwhelming principle puts you in a bad place.
One of the things that struck me as we were talking and making our presentations is the two different kinds of methodologies, I think, on display. Not surprisingly, Michael and I tend to refer to the lessons of history, and whereas I don't think Peter does that as much, and that's one of the questions I was going to ask Peter: to what extent do the lessons of history figure into what you argue? As Marxists, the lessons of history are crucial as a way of avoiding kind of utopian kinds of solutions and so on. What does history actually teach us? And one of the things I'm going to ask Michael, I agree with everything that Michael said, but what I didn't hear, though, was any discussion of independent working class political action. That is, the working class having its own political party. And that, to me, I think, goes a long way in explaining the crisis of the labor movement. Once the labor movement went into the Democratic Party, and it's still there, and it's politically neutered. It has little to show. The longer it stays in, the less it has to show. The last time I think the labor movement was really vibrant is when it was really independent of the two capitalist parties. And the lesson for Marx and Engels, that was the lessons of 1848, 1849, that Lenin kept hammering on. That is, the working class needs its own political party. The fight for an independent working class political action. And so what happens, yeah, we can not be disappointed. We may not have had any expectations about Obama, but that's not enough, I think. We have to have an alternative. Otherwise, workers, they will end up voting for the bureaucracy, the misleadership of the unions and so on. They're going to put all of their energy into voting for Obama. And a part of this question of independent working class political action, which I think is perhaps the major stumbling block, at least politically, for the left and progressive forces, I think, is lesser evilism, the lesser of two evils. And this is why I quoted Marx from the 1850 document about don't be deterred as workers in putting forward workers' candidates by the claim of liberals that by voting for workers, somehow you're going to allow the reactionaries to get elected. And Lenin went into great detail on this because Lenin had to deal with a set of forces that were incipient fascist forces within Russia called the Black Hundreds. And every time elections came up for the Dumas and so on, the liberals, the cadets, would say, no, you got to vote. If you all have candidates, the Bolsheviks, you all have candidates and so on, you're going to allow the Black Hundreds to get in. And so the Mensheviks always bent to the line of the cadets and tried to downplay, therefore, independent working class political action. But Lenin wrote reams and reams on this question. And I think it's one of the biggest problems that confronts progressive forces today, and that is the lack of independent working class political action. Otherwise, the default position is the Democrats. That's the default position. And it's no accident, I'll end on it, it's no accident that that Lenin's electoral strategy is not known in most left circles. It was the most amazing thing when I was doing the research for this, because Lenin spent enormous hours, I estimate a third of his political work, certainly between 1905 and 1917, was looking at electoral politics and parliamentary questions and so on. And you're hard pressed to find anything within, even sympathetic. You can understand why the opponents, the enemies of Lenin, won't cover this topic. But the friends of Lenin won't deal with this topic. And I think it has a lot to do with a number of influences, not the least of which is how influential the Popular Front policies coming out of the Comintern, the last Comintern meeting in 1935, and how much that has affected much of the left, even those who are not actively involved in the left. The Popular Front. And I think this goes a long way in explaining, indeed, why Lenin's electoral strategy is ignored. Because Lenin's electoral strategy is the last thing to do with the Popular Front. There's nothing in Lenin's electoral strategy that would even provide any support to a Popular Front perspective.
I think August's question, your first one, hits it right on the head. The lessons of history, I think, is what we should be framing our discussions around. And I think it's notable that we come back, the three of us come back to a similar set of historical points of reference. 1848, the Paris Commune, the Wobblies, a fantastic example of the riven, conflicted nature of democracy within left contexts. It's definitely true that we have, in some cases, strikingly different interpretations of what the lessons are that should be drawn from each of those cases. But I am a big fan, so to speak, a big proponent of the idea of immersing ourselves as revolutionaries and as radicals in the history of the French Revolution, of the Haitian Revolution, of 1848, 1849. I'm especially big on things like the more or less failed councilist revolutions in the immediate aftermath of World War I, 1918 and 1921 or so across Central Europe. A lot of those, the Spanish Revolution, that's a good one we could have lots of disagreements about. Those are the sorts of things that it would behoove us to talk through those histories more and sort of sort out where do we think we stand on the issues that they raised. I also think Mike is absolutely right about the repressiveness of majorities, whether we conceive those in religious terms. I very much take your point about the religious sectarianism of the early American Republic, even before the Republic, and the colonial period, and that is a real weakness, one of several important weaknesses of Arendt's work. But it's especially important in the racial sense. What happens when you have majorities who are bent on misusing the power that is built into a democratic process in order to deliberately exclude another group of people based on the color of their skin or what have you. Mike's own work on this question, Dave Roediger's work on this question, those are another very important set of historical lessons. The thing is, I don't see that as a problem with majorities. I don't see that as a problem that is built into democratic structures or organizations. I see that as the problem of white supremacy and the way that it pollutes and undermines otherwise noble and valuable sets of goals and attempts. I also think it's maybe leading us down the wrong track to sort of identify democracy with majority rule. That's not the conception of democracy that I find particularly compelling, although I happily concede that at some point when a decision has to get made and you're not getting towards some sort of agreement or consensus, you're going to have to sort of come down to some voting procedure. I happen to be partial to the agonistic models that I talked about before that are all about disagreement. I'm not a big fan of consensus models for what it's worth. But that's not really the same thing as saying that democracy is a matter of majority rule. Last but not least, I did not mean to suggest, and I think I did, that the tradition that I come out of with its sort of fixation on spontaneous and small scale, that's not actually where I'm coming from. I think that's a genuine limitation of a lot of anarchist ideas and beliefs about democracy. I think it sort of has evolved into sort of an anarchist myth. I would like to get beyond it personally. I'm more meant to be honest about that's my background and that's sort of the half-assed and not very satisfactory answer that a lot of anarchists usually bring to discussions like that.
All right, so we're going to open it up to questions. I'm going to go ahead and start there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm a little concerned with the notion of labor politics for the party of labor. We have sort of experience since Lenin's time with labor-based parties. For example, the British Labour Party or the Italian Communist Party, both were mass-based and by a large majority working-class parties. Both of them failed in different ways, but they failed abysmally to achieve any sort of working class power, which is presumably the point of a working class party. So maybe it's simply just a beginning to say the working class needs their own party. What's more important is to say what kind of party, in fact, can lead to working class power, and how to avoid the failures of the previous generation.
Maybe you'd like to take it?
Can I just?
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I thoroughly agreed. I didn't get a chance to develop this point that Lenin makes called revolutionary parliamentarism. And what he's doing is, his argument, he's got to explain what happened in 1914, the vote for funding the war. Why did parties, the social democratic parties that had just voted 2 years before at the Basel Conference of the Socialist International, that if war begins in Europe, all social democratic deputies would vote against funding the war. All of the Bolsheviks took it seriously. And so he has to explain what happened. And he argues that leading up to that vote, you began to see social democratic parties, that's when the term social democratic had a real meaning, began to see the parliamentary process not as a means for taking power, but rather as a means for trying to win seats, win positions, and so on. And it began to have a stake within the electoral process and the parliamentary process itself. Whereas revolutionary parliamentarism, you're using the electoral arena in order to determine when you have the sufficient numbers to take power. And by 1914, I think all of the parties you're talking about were no longer, that simply wasn't their thing. And so the vote that took place then in August, the fateful vote in August 1914, with the German party leading the way, was a reflection of a process that had been in place for a number of years. So that's what Lenin is trying to do: distinguish between having the working class having its own political party and pursuing a revolutionary strategy, as opposed to what was happening within an increasing number of parties. So yes, so a new international comes. That's exactly, you form a new international. Hope you can win new, because most of those parties is split. You had a revolutionary wing with Luxemburg and Liebknecht in Germany, and other you had revolutionary wing who split. A lot of those parties split, and so you're trying to forge a revolutionary international. And with regard to the communist parties and so on, the Italian communist, by 1935, if you were going along with the Popular Front policies of Comintern and so on, you pretty much we shouldn't be surprised at the outcome of what happens later with the communist parties. The same thing happens in Latin America. You can see all the communist parties in Latin America. This is why the Cubans felt they had to go. The Cubans had to go a different way. And there was a tendency sometimes, people interpreting the Cuban Revolution, to think that participating in parliamentary politics should never be done, because it is inherently corrupting. Once you get involved in parliamentary politics, it is inherently compromising and so on. And so, going back and learning what Lenin actually stood for, I think, is the way to challenge.
Can I ask you, well, I mean, you're saying then it's not the composition of the party, or even the program of the party, or the founding document, but the political line of the party, which makes it, so that which may very well be true in a given conjuncture. I'm not arguing with that, but if that's the case, then one really has to go beyond simply being independent of the bourgeois parties. I mean, the Communist Party really was a working class party. It was independent of the existing bourgeois parties. It was very powerful after the Second World War. You can argue it failed because it adopted a reformist position or whatever. It's a long argument. But it's not only the composition or the fundamental sociological orientation that matters. It's the political line and the ability to adopt a line that's.
No, did either of you want to opine on this? Mike?
Why don't you let
Okay,
more people? I think that's
Ben?
okay. No, I totally agree for us. Totally agree.
Thanks to the speakers for their talks tonight. I had two questions. The second speaker, I don't remember your name.
August.
One directed towards you and the assertion that you made towards the end of your opening remarks about the dictatorship of the proletariat existing in Cuba. And that raises a red flag for me immediately in the sense that, to me, if you take a country that's, in a sense, low down on the totem pole of powers in the world and treat its isolated political system as the dictatorship of the proletariat, you're really diminishing the content of that term originally kind of possessed for thinkers like Marx, who would have seen, or Lenin for that matter, who would have seen it as really something of an international aspiration. And I don't really see the linkage between, the Cuban politics currently on that you referenced and, international revolutionary politics kind of in any manifest or material way today. It seems like, while clearly they emerged in an international context, today it's relatively isolated politics. So it strikes me as something of a contradiction of terms in that sense. And I wanted you to kind of speak to that, and also then to relate how you see this question of the international scope of the tasks of the working class in a revolutionary sense to the question of democracy, which can't simply be hemmed in within a national framework or existing state framework. So how does democracy apply in the international sense? The other question I had, somewhat distinct from that one, I wanted to ask to Peter, and kind of make a point or something, which is that it seems to me that the draw to participatory democracy and its kind of rising star on the left today, in part has to do with the nature of the left today, which is that it has this self-selecting kind of, we get in a room and we enact quote-unquote democratic principles, but we've already all selected that we're leftists, and therefore our principles are largely in harmony, although of course there's differences of opinion. Nevertheless, everybody in this room would agree that racism is bad, whether you're anarchist, Marxist, what have you, right? But in reality, even the class that we're talking about as having the role of driving forward revolutionary developments in society, the working class, it can't be said to have any kind of unified ideology. And largely, probably it's the case that its ideology is informed more by right-wing and reactionary, political traditions than by Marxism or anarchism in the present, certainly. And so, it seems, Lenin once said that we have to make the revolution out of the human material available to us today. But what I think that phrase points to is the need to push it, to develop that material, not to take it as a static given that then you can kind of build consensus from. And so it also strikes me that when you say that it's the basis for renewed politics, it runs into conflict with the experience of the Occupy movement, where direct democracy actually pushed people to say, oh no, we're not political. No, we're interested in procedural practices. We're not interested in calling ourselves left at all. We're post-left. So I'm wondering how you kind of resolve some of that, the two of you, different. I know those are two different questions.
But should we take other questions from people, and then we can come back and...
That's fine with me.
All right, let's take one more. I'm sorry, you were next?
Well, I actually had a different question to ask, but this discussion that you raised is important. So I'll try to squeeze them together real quick. I've been a CTA railroad mechanic since 1985, and this discussion about independent political action about labor is something that we're talking about in Local 308, 241, bus and rail, because we're getting hammered by the government. And it's not just CTA workers, it's all workers, and it's the government itself that's doing it to us. It's the teachers, the privatizations, the health care, all the rest of this stuff. So we're talking about what are we gonna do, man? We're getting hit. The government is the enemy. So what are we gonna do? Well, you know, like my union president says, yeah, Rahm Emanuel's a bad guy. We should elect Preckwinkle instead. You know, so, I mean, there's talk about this. And of course, it's not just about, you know, who we should elect, because ultimately the question of using the strike weapon is really what it comes down to. Because if we don't, I don't care who we run, if we don't use the strike weapon, we like do what the teachers did, you know, we're not gonna have, you know, any leverage. You know, CTA workers are not a factor when CTA management sits down and decides to privatize. They just gave almost $500 million to this Ventra. They privatized the fare collection jobs of the guys who work, you know, who were the fare collectors, members of my union. They gave $500 million to this. You know, until you add to a private company. So ultimately, yeah, you have to use the strike weapon, but at the same time, you know, just to say, even if it's not revolutionary, I mean, we'll fight for that, but any kind of break from this idea that don't make any waves, Preckwinkle, we can get her in, you know, things will be a little bit cooler. It's like, no, the idea of independent political action, both in the streets, and at the ballot, you know, I think is a good thing. So that was, but the other thing I was going to just say something about was Cuba. You know, I've been attracted to Cuba because I think what he said was right. That's the one place where workers have political power. What's it look like? I've been there a couple times. The first thing you know, the U.S. rulers say Cuba is not a free country, and they are right from their point of view. It's not free. They can't make any money there. They can't plunder the resources of Cuba. They can't lay anybody off. They can't clear cut any forests. It's a terrible place for them. But for us, what does it look like when we hold, and the majority holds power? Children, #1 priority. Health care, education, eliminate homelessness, land to the farmers that don't have. So, yeah, my question, and I actually, because I got this beef, there's all these leftists, you know, but when it comes to standing up for Cuba, and I don't care, you don't have to think Fidel Castro or whoever is the greatest person, but can you at least stand up for, like, Cuba's basic rights? There's a guy who was just here, this is the Cuban 5, the most important issue in U.S.-Cuban relations. Man, when this thing came out, there were no leftists who came out to this event. Like, why doesn't the leftist, you know, stand up, defend Cuba? You don't have to support it, you agree with it, but at least defend it. Defend the right to exist. Thank you very much. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about, you know, why that weakness is there.
You guys want to go into this closer?
Yeah, I want to talk, I'll try to be real concise and talk about 3 things. Cuba. Okay, so Mel and I a long time ago wrote a book about the Soviet Union on attacking and criticizing various Maoist theories about the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union. And we argued, which we've talked, that it's called the Myth of Capitalism Reborn, Marx's critique of various theories of the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union. And I agree with you and I don't know your name, but August, about the many exciting things that have happened in Cuba because of the elimination of capitalism. Still, in our view, and I think that the Soviet Union, I spent time in East Germany before the wall, and I think that they were able to do a lot of interesting things, full daycare, education, highly educated population, very cheap basic services and food. But still, these societies have stalled, partly for external reasons, in their ability to make any transition towards socialism. So to say, and I agree with some of your reservations, that this is the dictatorship of the proletariat and that they're not stalled, barring some major revolutions in more democratic countries, in more developed countries, is to create too many too many overblown positive things about what really exists there in terms of their ability to control their own destiny. And there's a lot of things. I was highly critical of Chavez in Venezuela, and half the things he said I couldn't. His relationship with Ahmadinejad, with all sorts of other things, seemed to me to be perhaps by necessity, but reactionary. So I think that there's a lot to discuss, as there was with the former Soviet Union. In relation to what you asked about the working class today, I think that without organization, workers cannot think big or broadly or anything else. And I take the example of the state of West Virginia. Used to be the most unionized state in the country. Miners and the population in general were very liberal. They weren't radical, but they didn't have any of these backwardness that we associated now. With the destruction of unionism and the decline of the coal industry in West Virginia, people become atomized. They cling to religious beliefs and all sorts of other defensive, narrow-minded things. And I think that that's what's happened to a lot of people. And this is, things can change dramatically with important struggles or events. I keep waiting for something, these sort of things to happen. But the paradigmatic example was in the 1905 revolution, where hundreds of thousands of people went with holding their crosses and with their chaplains to plead to the Tsar for some sort of relief, and then they were all killed in the revolution. 1,000 people, or however many, were killed, and the 1905 revolution began, and the Bolsheviks gained lots more influence. And this relates to the independent party, and I'm surprised you accused me of that, because in one of the books you said you used in class.
I know.
I spent a lot of time talking. Well, you can't say everything. The United States is exceptional. American exceptionalism is a term that Stalin coined, so it's sort of bizarre that all these Tea Party types are extolling American exceptionalism. It comes from the Comintern, and it was an accusation made against the Americans who thought there couldn't be a revolution because American was exceptional. And what's exceptional is that we haven't had a major left-leaning working class party, and this is what, even in these countries where the parties, and these parties have all fallen apart and become not that different from the Democratic Party. I spent time in Germany, and the Social Democratic Party looks like the Democratic Party, or at least the liberal wing of the Democratic Party here. But in many of these countries, certain traditions linger on. In France, you periodically have general strikes that we can't imagine here. And all these countries, of course, have full national health care and a variety of other social programs that ameliorate the condition of the working class and others. And so the lack of such a party here not only eliminates those benefits, but keeps the working class here more atomized and open to reactionary and backward, if I can put a value judgment on it, types of beliefs than exists in those countries. In France, when they take a poll, when the transportation workers go on strike, and I've been in France when the rail systems were cut down and I had some place to go, the overwhelming majority of people who can't get to work in Paris support the workers. I mean, at this point in this country, that's not what happens in those situations. So the parties fall apart politically, and people have to rebuild again, and times sometimes change very rapidly, and let's hope that the not-too-distant future are one of those times.
Should I go next?
Yeah.
I think this dual question about the self-selecting nature of the left today and the sort of anti-political fleeing from the wreckage of Occupy, that is one of the toughest questions for a lot of us to face right now. To my mind, the self-selecting part, I don't think that's, historically speaking, all that unusual. What's unfortunate and unusual is the sort of dire state of the left in the U.S. today. Not the fact that left movements are very often self-selecting in lots of different contexts. Our problem is not the self-selection, but it's genuinely difficult when you have a social context that makes the kind of people who might otherwise be potential listeners and not potential recruits, but potential people, you could have potential interlocutors when they are convinced that the existing administration is already on their side because they think it's a liberal administration or progressive administration or God knows what. That just makes it a lot harder. It is paradoxically easier to do left organizing when you've got Bush in charge or when you've got Reagan in charge or somebody like that. The fallout from Occupy, that's a tough one. I have to sort of watch my words because I didn't make it out to New York until December or something, so I missed most of the good stuff. My impression, secondhand as it is essentially that it has a lot to do with the weaknesses of the Occupy model. If you're saying we are all the 99%, and that's awesome, and that's all it takes, and it's the 1% that is the problem. That's a classic form of populism that just is not going to get you very far in terms of a radical politics. It is a critique of capitalism that I'm happy to hear any critique of capitalism, but it's a critique of capitalism that is pretty weak sauce. And it also had the drawback of focusing strongly on the financial sectors of capitalism. That's historically a dangerous and bad idea. Thankfully, it didn't work out as bad as it could have in the case of Occupy. I don't think it's all that shocking to find that a lot of people are now sort of distancing themselves from the whole notion of being political. One of the things that capitalism does that distorts our view of the world is it separates out supposedly private chunks of human existence from supposedly public chunks, and it kind of it gives this bad nimbus around what it means to be doing politics. Most people associate politics with the pulling the lever every 4 years, or with the liars who are constantly on television promising stuff that they're never going to do. It's hard to get across the idea that politics could be the way we collectively run our lives together as whatever, as a people, as workers. Take your pick. That's not the easiest notion to bring across, and it means that we have to sometimes be selective about what we even call political, quote unquote, in the first place.
That's a very quick follow-up.
Yeah, on Occupy, I don't know what portion of it, but I think some of that energy found its way into the re-election of Obama. And you could almost see it building up, because it's happened before with social movements before. The Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements in the United States certainly since the Second World War. And I remember during the immigration rights protests in 2006, and the most massive protest actions, larger than many of the civil rights actions. But you could see as the elections, 2008 was getting, those of us in these coalitions, you had all these forces who were saying, well, we got to elect Obama. You know, that was the line. You could see the energy going into the electoral process. And as you know, this was always an issue during the anti-war movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement. Every time an election came up, do we call off the demonstrations or not? Let's suspend the demonstrations in order to get a Democrat elected. That was always the. So I raise this because it's related to, again, what I'm trying to hammer home, the importance of independent working class political action. On Cuba, those of us who do Cuban solidarity work have different opinions about this question, but I, for one, believe that the Cuban Revolution is indeed isolated at this time. There's no doubt about it. And it cannot hold out indefinitely until the working class takes political power elsewhere. And in the long run, I argue, the future of the Cuban Revolution will depend upon the working class taking power in this country. You can't hold out indefinitely with an island that size. At the same time, what's to me so exciting about Cuba is, given all of its size, what it has been able to do. That to me is, it suggests what can be done when the working class takes power. And there are numerous examples, but I'll just say a couple of them. Mandela has said, and has said on numerous occasions, were it not for what the Cubans did in Southern Africa, apartheid would not have come to an end. The Cuba, all out of proportion to its size, the troops it sent to fight against the South African regime. There's a new book that's just come out by Piero Glejeses. It's the definitive account, because he was able to get into Cuban archives, Soviet archives, U.S. archives, and so on, to make the case, indeed, how noble, how significant what the Cubans did in Southern Africa, all out of a proportion to its size, against the wishes of the Soviet Union, against the wishes of the Soviet Union. Another example for me is I'm from New Orleans, and both my parents had to leave New Orleans because of Katrina, but not because of Katrina. Actually, it was the social disaster in New Orleans that was revealed by Katrina. It was the aftermath and so on. And in the social sciences, seldom do we have an opportunity to do controlled experiments. But the closest one I think we had is to see Katrina, what happens when Katrina went through Cuba, and what happened when it got to the Gulf Coast. It was much stronger when it went through Cuba. And less than 5 people died in Cuba, as opposed to 1,600 people in the Gulf Coast. I argue it's exactly because the dictatorship of the proletariat is in place in Cuba. That's why the Cuban working class did not suffer the way the working class in southern Louisiana did. Exactly because of what's in looking at the Philippines right now, this tragedy that's unfolding in the Philippines. You see what happens when the working class is not in power. This kind of tragedy. So yes, it's small. So was the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune only lasted 2.5 months. But boy, we were inspired by it. Lenin milked everything he could of the lessons of the Paris Commune. And therefore, I think there are important lessons, major lessons in the Cuban example. Just finally on yes, the working class in Europe comes out and strikes in much larger numbers than some, but the problem isn't the strikes. The problem, that's great, but when are you going to take power? It's one, in Greece you keep coming out for these mass protests, the general strikes and so on, 24-hour general strikes. But the question of do you have a perspective for actually taking power? If you don't take power, the working class doesn't take power, what you described, this is what's increasingly is going to happen. And it's exactly because the strikes are led by both the Communist Party and the Social Democrats. Much of the union leadership explains why there's been no real effort, I think, to take power.
Okay.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. What are the lessons of Cuba? You talked about how Lenin was influenced by and learned from the lessons and problems.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
So what are the lessons to be learned from? How does the Cuban Revolution deepen the problem in the way that the Paris Commune did?
Right. Yeah. Well, I was to be more when I gave the example of Katrina and so on, and the contrast with New Orleans, where because the working class is in power, the working class has a state that mobilizes solidarity Whereas when in New Orleans, you were told by the mayor you had to get out on your own. Or when Sandy hit in New York, Bloomberg's perspective, or in the Philippines and so on. When you have a state, when the working class is in power, it's able to organize itself in a way that's not the case in a capitalist society. It has life and death consequences. In other words, the working class in power or not in power has life and death consequences. Only the Cubans could have done what they did in southern Angola. The Soviet Union wasn't prepared to do it. Only the Cubans were willing to do what they did. I think the overthrow of apartheid was a major advance. It's a major advance for the working class, internationally.
Ten.
This question's for the middle speaker. And this isn't totally based on what your presentation was about, but other interactions that I've had with, it's, as you mentioned, it's like hard to pin anarchists down. So, like, I would like to know what exactly does someone that comes from your tradition, how do you deal with the working class taking power? Like, and oftentimes when you speak with anarchists about the working class taking power, or like concepts like the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's like very hard because people do want to talk about both spontaneity and they also want to talk about localism. And you said that those were problematic categories for you, so I was hoping that you could kind of unpack that and then also talk about how do you like transform society without that step of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right. That's a fantastic question. For better or worse, I'm not a typical anarchist on several of those scores. So I can tell you what I think, but it's not all that representative. There are much more experienced and eloquent anarcho-syndicalists, including the group that Mike actually started out with what I thought was a pretty apt criticism an hour ago. Now, I'm not a syndicalist myself, but some of those folks would be better suited to answer the question. But very, very briefly, I think anarchists, to a large extent in North America today, North American anarchists are not necessarily on the same wavelength as a lot of anarchists in other parts of the world, but for a lot of North American anarchists today, what worker even means is a totally unclear question. It's completely undecided. The simplest version is anybody who doesn't own a substantial portion of the means of production. And that's, you're back to the 99% again. If 99% of us are workers, it's not a very specific category anymore. That's not the fault of anarchists. That's, to my mind, that's just a general problem of making sense of inherited left categories. As far as the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that's not something that most anarchists are very friendly toward. A lot of anarchists in the US, also Canada, after the 1960s, they're indebted to people like Marcuse. Marcuse had this notion that, to simplify a little bit, that the working class had sort of had its historical chance to be the agent of revolutionary change. It had more or less missed that chance, not through its own fault, and that today for Marcuse being the 1960s, the agents of revolutionary change were no longer situated in the working class, but were more sort of groups that were somehow marginalized by society, so that for him there was students and women, people of color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of anarchists are drawn to that without even necessarily knowing much about where that theory comes from. They're often drawn to that notion for reasons that I think are actually not a bad thing, but a good thing. But it does mean that the idea that putting the working class in charge all by itself changes the political nature of society is something a lot of anarchists would reject. It gets rid of capitalism. It does that. It does the trick on that score. It does not all by itself, in our view, in the view of a lot of anarchists, change what we think needs to be changed about all the other facets of society that are sort of characterized by hierarchy and domination.
Okay, so can I just ask a follow-up? So then how does someone from your perspective think about transforming? How would you take power?
I am terrible at answering questions like that. I'm good at sort of super long-term historical stuff and very small scale. How do you do a functioning worker collective? That I can talk about for hours on end. I am a genuinely bad strategic thinker. I don't have any good ideas about how to even move into 2 years from now, much less take power 10 years from now. I have to plead ignorance and incapacity on that score. That's not true for what it's worth of lots of other anarchist thinkers out there, but it's true of me. I could say something, but it would sound stupid and vague and nebulous.
One sec.
Hi, so I have 3 questions. Okay, so the first question is for Professor Goldfield. I want to, could you clarify the meaning that you take from the 1931 Kentucky coal miners' strike? Because I think I completely agree with you that it should emphasize the importance of the party in politicizing purely labor-motivated movements. But I don't agree that it presents to us an opposition of democracy to emancipation, that somehow democracy sort of had to be overruled, in order to emancipate the coal miners from their sort of backwards understandings of race. And I think that it seems to me rather that it might be more meaningful to think about emancipation as some form of control or the struggle for the ability of a person to control his own life, or of society to assume some sort of self-mastery, or of society to assume some sort of self-consciousness. And it seems that that is actually the end. On the one hand, that is the end of democracy, is this attempt to politicize otherwise objective objective economic relations that we sort of contemplate, suffer passively. And on the other hand, it seems that it's that lack of control over life, it's that lack of society self-consciousness that is productive of these different types of backwards racisms or clinging to religions in modern society. So could you clarify what you meant by this, by sort of opposing democracy to other social values like equality or justice or something like that? Because I think that for Marx, at least, for example, in the critique of the Gotha program, he disagrees with a lot of the Lassalleans in their attempt to separate questions of democracy, separate questions of politicizing economic relations from social things like child labor or from like education and those types of things. Because for him, all those questions are, I think, enveloped by questions of class struggle. And it is that like the sort of the relationship between democracy and class struggle that also is enveloping these other questions about equality or race or gender or something like that, that it has a special place. So yeah, I was wondering if you could clarify that. Secondly, my question for Professor Nimtz is that I suppose I take your point about how Cubans might have suffered less under Hurricane Katrina, and I certainly do agree that with your assessment of Hurricane Katrina being something that was less of a natural disaster, much more of a social disaster. But however, I want to sort of repose Ben's point or question as so like what is I think for Lenin and for Marx, the national revolution is made only as a contribution to the international working class movement. So what is Cuba doing to make the world revolution? What has it done to make the world revolution? What can it do right now? What is it going to do in the future? My third question, my third question is directed to the one of our members of the audience. I think you mentioned the need for the necessity of a CTA strike, and I was just wondering. So I agree with you that the question of the strike, the necessity of the strike, and what it can be for workers and other people has to do with the question of what kind of party options are available. But at the same time, I want to ask what the value of conducting a strike would be in terms of just for society. I think like in my mind when I'm thinking of strikes that affect our daily lives, so for example, general strikes up and down the West Coast in 1901, 1902. Those general strikes, because they were general, it was okay that that certain railroads had shut off, milk delivery services weren't running, because the general strike itself was running those services. And you'd had cars that are going through the roads that are approved by the General Strike Committee, and they are the ones who are delivering milk. They are the ones who are making So I was wondering, like, what would the value in a context where there isn't a general strike, what would the value be for society? Of, for example, why should people support the CTA strike when it seems to affect them negatively, and when it doesn't seem to, or doesn't, at least to your average person in Chicago, point to a replacement with better services or something?
I'm the non-professional, so
So,
of course I don't have to remember, and after. We're getting hammered, but the same people that are hammering us are hammering you, all right? So if we fight back, that's in your interest, all right? Anytime, I would like that, we were politically advanced enough to be able to, conduct actually, we're not even in a position to conduct a strike right now.
As a union.
Yeah, that's it. But I'd like, if we were, that we'd be, conscious enough, and then enough other workers would be conscious enough, we'd be able to do things like, in Europe, at least in the past, when transit workers would go on strike, they wouldn't not come to work. They just wouldn't collect fares. Right? So that was the strike. It's like, all right, we're running the transit system the way it should be, free. It's like school, right? Like, why should you don't pay when you go into first grade. Why should you pay when you get on a train? It's a public service. So I'd like that, but, so we're not there, but, like, that's what they try to do. They try to drive this wedge. It's like, well, oh, look, these privileged guys, like, oh, they're trying to, they want you to raise fares, and, they try to turn us against each other, but no, I mean, it's in our interest to try to explain to people as much as we can, but, however well we explain it and however well we do it, the fact remains that anytime any section, of the working class can defend it, like I said, we're getting hammered. I got a 10% wage reduction. I got, my health care is doubled. The retirees had their health care benefits taken away from them. They're paying $1,200 a month now for what was guaranteed to them for free. We got $9.50 an hour workers on the property. No benefits, 0 benefits, but they pay union dues, so I mean, yeah, so anytime anybody stands up for, and I don't know, I mean, where else would you compare it to? It's like, well, why should we support blacks in the South in 1960 or something like that? It's like, well, I mean, either people get it or they don't get it, but, I think people are attracted by that when people stand up and fight, and it does, but yeah, things are pretty weak, and, not maybe as clear as they would be if there were a lot more unions and all, but I think the teachers union, showed the way, was a real good example. They were, like, they weren't out to, like, give us more money. They were saying, we're trying to defend public education here in Chicago. And so they were able to rally the students and the parents and communities and everybody else behind them to defend public education from what the capitalists and their government are trying to do. So I think that's the way to go. So.
Do you want to know?
yeah. Okay, I think Wantai asked some good questions. So the importance of the 1931 Harlem County miners' strike, which is one of the most famous pre-unionization strikes of the 1930s, is not an argument as much against democracy as against extolling spontaneity. And I think that there are tendencies out there, a lot of the anarchists, people think spontaneity is great. Well, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And this is an example of where it isn't, and it emphasized the importance of leadership in a democratic, that has principles that they fight for. And most of the union movement caved into racism, particularly the so-called right wing, meaning the liberals in the CIO, capitulated to racism, particularly in the South. And being intransigent on what you consider the most important principles is a virtue. And that was the importance of that example. And let me just touch, so I hope I did that quickly, but what does it mean to be a workers' state and for the dictatorship of the proletariat to exist? It seems to me that the only working class revolution was the one in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. That was carried out by workers and soldiers and sailors, Soviets, democratically elected things by the constituents. And here I'm probably going to side more with the perspective maybe that Peter rejected. But, so the revolution was carried out over a course of struggle. The Bolsheviks played a leadership role at winning these constituencies to a revolutionary position. But what happened during the course of the Civil War and having to run a society, most of the advanced workers, Bolsheviks, were either killed because they were at the forefront of the battle, or they were drawn into the administration of the state. Lenin and Trotsky thought that the party would substitute, because it had no choice, for the working class leadership. But Lenin also argued with respect to the trade unions, this time against Trotsky, that workers had to be protected from their own state and that trade unions had to be democratic and independent of the state in the Soviet Union. So this experience after the 1871 Paris Commune seems to me key to understand. And so what happened in the Soviet Union, because there was no working democracy, the bureaucracy eventually took over. Now, eliminating capitalism has lots of benefits, and among those are the things that the Cubans have been able to do. South Africa, and it's impressive. They said during hurricanes, your cars go behind. We're sending public buses in to take everybody out. What I thought was even worse was in Houston when they thought there was going to be a hurricane, they told people to evacuate, and 20 hours later, people were only a few miles outside of town and had run out of gas, right? This is no way to run a society. So the idea that individualism is rejected and collective behavior and that capitalist interests are not a factor is key. But that doesn't make for the dictatorship of the proletariat that the actual control of workers, and once we get to China, Cuba, Vietnam, these were not, although there were working class components, these were not revolutions made by working classes. They were made by guerrilla army in Cuba, a large army, peasant insurrections, a large army in Vietnam, which fought a heroic and militarily impressive battle, and in China, largely peasant revolutions, and the idea of urban working class revolutions was rejected by Mao and people against other people who argued for the cities. And so these were not worker states, although they abolished capitalism, and all these states have stalled in the transition to socialism for various reasons, and something we argue about the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union seems to be a key experience to understand, along with the Paris Commune, of what happens to these societies, all of whom were in economically undeveloped countries and at the mercy of a much more powerful world market and more powerful capitalist states. So there's lots to learn, but I think that in learning that we can't over-romanticize any of the things that have happened in these multitude of states. And this is a longer discussion, to carry out. None of it's belittled some of the interesting things that were done, including, if people want to have this discussion, I thought that many things in East Germany were very impressive, a penny for public transportation to go anywhere, and housing that was 2 or 3% of people's disposable income, etc. But so in any case, these things are tied together, in my opinion. But I'll stop.
There was another factor that Trotsky certainly and Lenin recognized that explained why at the end, Lenin, by the way, never called the Soviet Union socialist. He called it a deformed worker state. And he understood very clearly, the problems that they were facing. The failure of the Russian Revolution to spread westward. And Marx and Engels, Engels in 1895 states very clearly that yes, the revolution can begin in Russia, but it will only be fulfilled if it spreads westward. Lenin says the same thing as early as 1905, if not before then. Whether or not there will be a social transformation in Russia will depend upon the revolution, the proletariat of the West coming to our aid. And for a brief moment, it looked like that was the case. But we know the betrayals that took place. So the internationalism is very important. It's related to the Cuba question. And internationalism is very important. And Marx and Engels understood this with the Paris Commune. I mentioned the parallels between them. 2.5 months is the Paris Commune. And one of the things that Marx did was to try to get the Paris Commune, the communists to link up with other cities. They understood that you had to break out of the circle of Paris in order to be able to survive. It had to. They even had these balloons, actually, where they were trying to send leaflets to the peasants. Because they realized Marx kept hammering home to them the necessity of linking up with the peasantry. So they were not as internationalists as they should have been. And that's where Marx comes in. And Marx, in writing The Civil War in France, he's trying to do everything he can to publicize what the commune is about. And that's what I think for defenders of the Cuban Revolution, that's our task today, to publicize what the Cubans have done. The Cubans are oftentimes kind of modest about these things, and I understand, it's understandable why. But it's our task and so on to defend them, to defend the Cuban Five, for example. It is true, in the early years of the revolution, they were much more conscious about trying to extend the revolution. And by the way, the way in which the Cuban Revolution took place, in which I think the dictatorship of the proletariat came to power, was really between 1959 and about 1961. The guerrilla army simply broke the back of Batista's army. Remember, the guerrilla movement in Cuba only lasts 25 months. It's the general strike on January 1st, 1959. That's when the working class comes out into the streets. The working class puts its stamp on the Cuban Revolution. So they were very conscious from the very beginning about trying to spread the Cuban Revolution. Che Guevara's famous slogan at the conference in 1964, 65, 1, 2, 3 more Vietnams. They understood that their survival depended upon the extension of the Cuban Revolution. And by 1969, with the death of Che and Washington's hostility and so on, they were limited in what they could do in Latin America, and they began looking more and more at Africa. And I think the internationalism, what they did in I can't emphasize enough the importance. The overthrow of apartheid has made it possible, I think, for the working class in South Africa to go into motion. In the same way that the overthrow of Jim Crow in the United States has made it easier to talk about class. As long as an all-white regime was in power in South Africa and so on, it was easy to look at the struggle through the lens of race. But with the overthrow of apartheid now, you've got a regime in power that's of your same skin color. And so now the class struggle is on the agenda in South Africa in a way that it hasn't been before.
Let's hope so.
And I mean, look at the farm workers. The farm workers went out on, first time in the history of South Africa, farm workers have gone out on strike and so on. So in that sense, the Cuban Revolution plays an enormously important role. So yes, something else I was going to. And yeah, largely by example. I think now, rather than trying to consciously extend revolutions, I think what the Cubans consciously are about is being an example. So the fact that they have medical and educational personnel in 66 countries has a major, major importance for some of the most impoverished countries in the world itself. It serves as a model for what proletarian internationalism should be. It's unlike in it that the Soviet Union never did it. China never did it. Vietnam never did it, and so on. It's the only. If anything, it's Cuba's proletarian internationalism is the best thing we have in the history of the socialist movement. There's no other country. I think there's no other country that is exemplary as Cuba when it comes to proletarian internationalism.
All right, so we have time for maybe one more round of questions and some closing remarks. Carlos? And, okay, Carlos?
So I'm kind of confused about the characterization of Cuba as a proletarian revolution, because as far as I understand, you know, it was a movement against Batista, and Fidel Castro was among many, for instance, who was fighting for the power in their student movements and about fighting for the democracy, which is fundamentally different from the struggles that happened in 1917, in my understanding, in 1971, in which the working class was actually organizing to take power over. And so to anyone who wants to speak on this, I guess my question is what would be the sort of lesson that we could learn from 1871 and 1917 specifically in terms of, politics that were about socialism, about transformation of consciousness in society, about transforming social relations, etc. Which I think you mentioned that Paris Commune was an example of this to a certain extent with the transformation of the debtors and creditors that Marx talks about. So, and some other examples that are actually in the text, of how the Paris Commune politically transformed at least the primary concerns of the Paris Commune.
And Nate?
Peter, you said something that kind of resonated with me, that about trying to make sense of inherited categories from the history of the left. And it made me think of sort of the discussion between in what way does history matter, and the idea of learning lessons from the past, a kind of slightly different take on that being that actually inherited categories or lessons can actually be deeply confusing and disorienting also, which I think is very true. And so that sort of made me think of two things. It first made me think of exactly why and how was it the case that Marx sort of saw something, kind of world historical, if you want to use that term, in the Paris Commune. And I think that had a lot to do, the kind of groundings for that claim had a lot to do with the international context, with the actual fact that you had a history of Chartism, you had what seemed to be a kind of, progressively greater kind of international socialist movement, for which, something like the Paris Commune could be a lesson. You kind of have a certain field of politics for that, which doesn't really seem to be the case now. So I think that ends up, rendering things deeply confusing. And so with something like, Occupy, one of the things that there's, I think Ben pointed out some of the kind of issues with that and kind of turning away from politics, but there were certain anti-political tendency in it. But there's also on another level a way in which was very kind of honest about itself and honest about its own kind of confusion, and kind of political. Immaturity is I guess kind of a derogatory term to kind of youngness or something, not quite knowing what to do. And so I guess my question would be if the idea is what we need is kind of a new international with new left parties, working class parties, labor parties, in solidarity internationally. How can we get from here to there, given a kind of the kind of depth of political confusion, which isn't just people not thinking about it enough. If anything, I think people probably fixate on it a lot, probably to an unhealthy degree, but that fixation is being driven by the deeply opaque character of what's politically necessary and what people doing. So I guess that would be my question. Given what I would characterize as a kind of confused state of politics today, including amongst leftists, how would we actually get to a point where you have something like a new international?
That's a good question.
I would like to respond to your comments and questions about the Cuban Revolution. I participated in 3 consecutive brigades, worker brigades from all across the United States. The Vince Ramos Brigade started right after the revolution. First brigadistas went to Cuba after an extensive education, self-education and group education from every city in the U.S. that sent brigadistas. This is fundamental to the support of a people's revolution. Fundamental because when I studied the Cuban Revolution, it was more about race, class, gender, than it was about politics. And when you look at when I looked at the Cuban Revolution, the 3 times that I actually went on the brigade, I realized that the issues of race and the struggle for workers' party in the United States cannot be separated from the issues of white privilege, of the issues of persons not being able to get married because they were in love, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender issues, the issues of women's rights in this country, and how the history of America has really impacted the Cuban Revolution. So when we talk about the Cuban Revolution, when you mention it, I listen for data. That means, what have you read about the Cuban Revolution? What have you experienced about the United States, the movements in the United States to support the Cuban Revolution? From 1965 up until right after the Cuban support of the Namibian defenses defeated the South African Defense Forces, which brought down the apartheid regime. That was part of it. That was the military part. But that was going on. What was going on as well was the sanctions, boycott, divestment movement in the United States that impacted directly the religious communities to get them to get their congregations on board with divestment from South Africa. Now, you cannot take these, when I look at it, I say, well, okay, what information is being presented from the persons that ask questions about the Cuban Revolution? Because every time that I went to Cuba, we met with, I can't say this too loudly, but anyway, Cuba had what is known as the Isle of Pines. The brigade went there. The Isle of Pines is where Fidel Castro and his band of revolutionaries were incarcerated. We visited the prison, but what was really important about that visit was that the Isle of Pines was set up as a school for the children of the frontline states in Africa who were engaged in armed struggle. It wasn't just the Cubans going after being invited to the frontline states by the revolutionaries in those states who were actively engaged militarily against the South African Defense Forces that the United States supported. And so if you take these movements out of context and the relationship that the United States has on them, then you're missing a major part of what this Cuban Revolution is really about. And for persons to say it's not a revolution of the proletariat, that says to me that they've never been to Cuba. They've never been to the collectives in Cuba. They have never sat with the women who run institutions in Cuba and asked them, how did they get the opportunity to be a major part of the running of this revolution? And a people's revolution is about people power. That means that people directly elect their representatives who then vote for other representatives. Now, I have a library. It's a small library because the Cubans, well, the library came directly from Cuba. And I smuggled this material into the United States because of the blockade that's been going, that United States is an illegal blockade. United Nations members have condoned this blockade. And we still, as a people, economically support that blockade. Now, my library
I'm sorry, sir.
says
Can you
to
wrap
me,
it up? I'd like to give
and the pictures
chance
that
to
I have
respond.
brought back of my travels in Cuba says to me that this is the only socialist people's revolution that has existed in this world, period. And I encourage any of you to get involved with IFCO Pastors for Peace, who has been sending caravans across the United States, through Mexico and to the border, gathering material goods to take to Cuba. Now, I'll bet you most of you don't even know half of what I'm
Again, sir,
sharing today.
I'd like to have
And
them,
so,
give them the opportunity to
I
respond before we have
encourage
to
you
leave.
to educate yourselves about what is going on the ground here in the U.S. to support that revolution.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, two things. So, quick on South Africa. I'm a materialist. I think that the support of the Cubans and outside international support was important, but it wasn't what made apartheid fall. What made apartheid fall is that in 1973, when the United States went off the gold standard, the main supply of gold outside of the Soviet Union was in South Africa. The investments made and the size of the working class quintupled, or went up 10 times within that decade of the 70s. What workers began to strike all over the country, and African workers, and the size of illegal unions went up 100-fold. And I have the data someplace in terms of membership of this stuff. And the capitalists could not govern. I have a nice quote from one capitalist said, "We need to recognize the unions. I cannot run a business when I have to negotiate with 1,500 workers every morning on a football field before I start work." And in the anti-apartheid movement, what's completely overlooked in this country or in much of the literature is the huge increase in the role of the South African working class in overthrowing the regime and in forcing the capitalists to come to terms with them in some formally democratic way. The working class struggle was usurped by the degeneration of the ANC and the Communist Party and whatnot. That's a whole long other story. So Carlos asks, I think, important questions. How does the working class exercise power in places where a revolution took place? Well, for the short period of time, the Paris Commune, Marx tells us how they did it. They had forms in which workers controlled the political activities of the state, democratic of some sort. In the Soviet Union, it was Soviets in which the Bolshevik Party participated that initially ran the state, and power was then eventually exercised by surrogates of the working class in terms of the Bolshevik Party, which degenerated, and what date you put for the degeneration probably tells what political tendency one would be in on the far left in terms of people who consider themselves Leninists or somewhere out of that tradition. The other revolutions, Cuba, and I have been to Cuba, Vietnam, China, did not have mechanisms for the working class to exercise that type of democratic power. And we're not talking about informal things, we're talking about formal things where they can tell the state or the party what to do. These were revolutions in which surrogates exercised power. There were revolutions where there were Soviets, at least initially, in Germany, starting at the end of World War I, which was defeated. Hungary had a revolution that lasted, couple months in which the working class try to exercise power. So this question of democracy and how does the working class exercise power? Directly, not informally or by influence or by surrogates. And that's what makes these, and all these revolutions, particularly as the Soviet Union stalled, became exercised by bureaucratic surrogates. And one could say maybe in Cuba it hasn't deteriorated the way that it has it did in the Soviet Union. But that's a question, and here democracy, democratic control, how does rule take place? And these are theoretical questions, no matter how much one likes lots of things that have happened in Cuba. And they also lead to how society will be run and should be run. And Mel and I write about a lot of this in this book that we published a long time ago. So I think those are important questions, and in my view, all these questions, whether it be South Africa or what's going on in Cuba or the Bolshevik Revolution and what's happening in America, are all sort of tied and together in one piece.
August?
I agree that on the eve of the Cuban Revolution, you didn't have Soviets in place, but there were particular historical reasons in Cuba about the history of the trade union movement. A lot of it was affiliated with the AFL-CIO, and a lot of it with all the problems that came, all the baggage that came with that. So in a sense, the revolution itself had to try to substitute or try to bring into existence new forms for the working class to be able to exercise power in a way that was different from the Soviet Union. But that's the hand that history has dealt us. And there will be lots of examples like that where we will have to figure out how to do it. And I think with all of the weaknesses and so on that exist within Cuba in terms of trying to institutionalize workers' control, I think on balance, the working class has more power in Cuba than the working class anywhere in the world.
Okay, very briefly, I think you posed a really superb question, which is impossible to answer, but it raises some potential answers that are worth thinking about. How do we puncture the opaque nature of basic political realities today, and maybe even move towards building some new political formation? You're calling it a new international. I'm happy to use that terminology. One sort of possible response to that is to say we should be open to the possibility that a lot of the traditional forms of revolutionary struggle that we learn about when we're learning about our own histories, that it is possible that some of those forms, maybe many of those forms, are simply not very applicable anymore in the struggles that people are facing today. I don't mean that all of them are obsolete, but we need to be open to the possibility that we will be in the uncomfortable position of having to create and innovate new forms, new categories, new ways of putting forward a different kind of social life, a different way of running our collective affairs together, where we don't have immediately relevant models from the past struggles. Those struggles can still inspire us. We can still use them for various sorts of lessons, but we might not be able to repeat the same things that they did because we aren't facing the same circumstances that they were facing.
That's right. I kind of mentioned him, but I was addressing my question to all three. Should have made that.
If history is offers any lessons about it, we know that new organizing, new internationals come out of struggle. That's how the Third International was formed. And Engels, by the way, always thought it was a mistake to form the Second International. He actually says we should wait till developments take place in Russia. We should wait until developments take place in Russia. And I think he was right in terms of what happened eventually to the second enactment. It did not come out of a revolutionary upsurge. So I have no doubt. No, we will. Right now, the working class is taking it on the chin. That's a fact. That's the world. That's true. And a part of it, I think, has to do with the misleadership within the union movement and the fact that the role of the Democratic Party in this process. And so I think there will be, once the working class begins to go into motion and so on, I think there'll be all kinds of regroupment, all kinds of discussions that will be taking place, and that's what happened before. That's happened before in history. I don't see any reason to think any differently.
Thank you. Round of applause for speakers, please.